Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session on our September seminar. Try saying that 3 times fast. Our second session of our September seminar on the life and legacy of Paul Robeson. Today's lecture will take us from where we left off last week and bring us all the way up to around 1936, 1937. So those are the years that we'll be covering. It's only 14 years, 1923 to 1937, but an impactful 14 years in the life of Paul Robeson. So as always, we record these sessions, so we'll have a Q&A in the middle, and then we'll have open discussion toward at the end, and the recording will be turned off. In addition, I also want to remind everyone that you can watch these lectures and all the lectures we've had here since we started at BIA Media on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you type in BIA Media, and then you go to live, you click live, and you'll see all the recordings of these live sessions because they're being uploaded to YouTube as we speak. The other thing I want to remind folks about, the course website. In your registration, you were provided a link to a course website. That's for you. That course website contains all the materials for the information that I'm going to be talking about. So it's constantly being updated. It's not complete, but it has the recordings of our sessions. It has links to the videos of full-length movies that Paul Robeson was in, links to the YouTube pages or the film archive pages that these movies are on. It also includes book chapters, journal articles, and full books that outline the life of Paul Robeson. Last thing before we get started, as I mentioned last week, largely this seminar, a lot of the material is coming from 2 books written by Paul Robeson's son, Paul Robeson Jr. It's really the same book in 2 volumes. One, The Undiscovered Paul Robeson, that goes from 1898 to 1939, and the second from 1939 to 1976. So these 2 books, if you're really interested in going more in depth on his life and more about what was personally going on with him during these years, these are the 2 books, because his son relies a lot on unpublished diary entries from both his mother and his father, correspondences that aren't available in archives that are actually, his personal records, photos that you can't find anywhere else. So these are the 2 volumes that you should get. And also another little book, Here I Stand, Paul Robeson's account of what happens to him in the 1940s and 50s, which we will get into next week. This is another book that I recommend as well. So we'll get right into it. Where we left off last week, we talked about Robeson as one of the most successful college and professional athletes in the early part of the 20th century. He dominated the football field for Rutgers University, and then he decides to go to law school. While all this is going on, we also talked about his genius level academic ability. He goes to the university not on an athletic scholarship, but on an academic scholarship. We talked about his achievements, his induction into numerous honor societies and college fraternities like Alpha Phi Alpha, Phi Beta Kappa, and the Skull and Cap Society at Rutgers University. We talked about him going to law school, getting into Columbia Law School and becoming a lawyer briefly, and how he played professional football to actually pay for law school. So it wasn't like he had aspirations to be a professional football player. He did it so he could make money to go to law school. But in the process, he becomes one of the best professional football players in the United States. Graduates law school, gets a job in a law firm in New York. One of the secretaries or stenographers in the firm says she's not going to take dictation from a nigger, and this starts to set him on the path of maybe this is not what I want to do with my life's work. while all this is happening, we didn't get too much into it last week. We touched on it briefly. He's also in New York during the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and he's engaging in the artistic scene in New York as well. And in 1922, he actually gets the invitation from one of his friends to act in a play based on Simon the Cyrenian, the African man that carried Christ's cross. If you are a Christian, you know the story in the Bible. Jesus of Nazareth is struggling with his cross, and he's about to be crucified, and they get this African guy to carry the cross up to Golgotha where Jesus is crucified. So he gets the invitation to play the lead in this play. Now, he had never acted on stage before, other than, in high school and doing little dramas in university and things like that. But this was his first time on stage in a professional setting, and he kills it. He does an amazing job. So he starts to get this acting bug. Maybe stage acting is something that I can do. He's also singing at this time. So again, he's an athlete, he's an academic, he's also been singing. He's been singing since he was young, since he was a child. And now he's singing in private audiences and people's houses and doing different things, making money here and there, singing. So he's thinking about his life. He's also newly married. He married Eslanda Cardoza, becomes Eslanda Robeson, his wife. And she encourages him. She says, look, if you want to be an artist, if you want to be a singer, if you want to be an actor, let's see if we can make this work. And she encourages him. And in fact, while he's making this transition from professional athlete, lawyer to singer, actor, she's actually the one supporting the family while he's actually figuring out how he's going to make this work and what acting gigs he can get. And at first he has to do some relatively stereotypical productions to make money. He's in a play called, or not a play, but more of a vaudeville show. Comedy is kind of playing off Negro stereotypes. It's not in blackface, but it's almost just as bad. But he's just doing this to make money. And eventually he says, I don't want to do this anymore. It's demeaning. It's stereotypical. I'm going to try to find acting jobs and roles and things that will allow me to express who I really am. So this is where we're at in 1923 when we come up on to retell the story of Paul Robeson's career and life. So today's objectives, today's discussion, what we're going to get into, we're going to talk about how Robeson made his mark as an actor both on stage and on film. Because it's during this time that he starts to do both. He's about 50-50, half stage actor, half film actor. We'll talk about Paul Robeson as a singer and his use of the Negro spirituals as folk music and his desire to place the Negro spirituals in the highest echelons of human art and his view of them as one of the most concrete expressions of African culture. Not just African American culture, but a continuation of African culture. And he sees this as the Negro spirituals as art to be appreciated on a global scale. So we'll talk about that and the controversy that brings up. Lastly, we'll talk about Robeson and the African worldview. How did Robeson and the African world view his role as an artist during this period? What was going on in the African world in the 1920s and 30s? And how did they view what he was doing? And then how did he view his participation in global events that were going to ultimately change the world and his connections to various African activists that begin in the 1920s and 30s? And this is also the period that he becomes an international figure. Up until right now, he's known in the U.S., very well known in the U.S. as an athlete, as an academic, particularly among black folks in the U.S., but he's going to become, in this period, an international figure. So we'll see how all that blossoms. So, as we ended last week, I owe my success to my wife, says Paul Robeson, as he begins to star in O'Neill's drama. Who is O'Neill? We're talking about Eugene O'Neill. And in 1922, Eugene O'Neill, who's a white man, writes a play called All God's Chillins Got Wings, based off of the title of a Negro spiritual. Eugene O'Neill's a very interesting white man. He's the son of Irish immigrants. He's a playwright, kind of eccentric, and his plays are very experimental for the time. This is the 1920s. So he writes this play, All God's Children Got Wings, And it's being put on in New York, and he asked Paul Robeson to play the lead. Now, here's what is interesting about this play. This play deals with an interracial marriage in 1922. An interracial marriage in 1922. And we just talked last week about lynchings, and we talked about Jack Johnson and how his relationships with white women are being perceived. So this is a very taboo subject in 1922. But Eugene O'Neill says, I'm going to tackle this head on. I'm going to talk about interracial marriage. I'm going to talk about how black folks view interracial marriage, as well as, of course, how white folks view interracial marriage. And I'm not going to make this a nice marriage. In this play, Robeson plays the character named Jim Harris. Jim Harris, very much like Robeson, is a bright, young black man who's actually studying for law school. He's trying to pass the bar exam, but he keeps failing. But he grew up with a childhood white friend, this white woman named Ella, and it follows them from childhood up to adulthood. Eventually, at some point in the play, Ella marries one of the white characters they grew up with, but they end up getting divorced, and she's despondent, and she's all this, and Jim has always had feelings for her, and she actually eventually marries Jim. But she ends up going through a psychosis type thing, and she starts to berate Jim and calls him a nigger several times, and she becomes abusive in the marriage. So you have these interesting dynamics. It just, I won't give away what happens in the play, but the fact that interracial marriage is being displayed on stage in 1922 was incredibly upsetting to a number of groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, who threatened to do bodily harm to Robeson to destroy the play, even though none of these threats actually happened. So the play goes off, and it's met with mixed reviews, but much of the acclaim goes to Robeson, because people who watch the play, they see his acting, and they're saying this guy is phenomenal. So this play goes on. I don't know if it's still in production. I think people still do it, but it sparked a lot of controversy when it was released. But it put Robeson on the road to fame, because once it came out about how his performances were, then he got other offers to do other plays. And while he's doing all this, he's also singing. So Eugene O'Neill, a year later, would ask Robeson to play in another one of his plays that he decided to write about black characters. Now, what's really interesting about Eugene O'Neill, he does a series of plays where the main protagonists are black folks. Again, he's a child of Irish immigrants, and this is what he decides to write on. He writes other plays about other things, but it's really interesting. However, and he wants to move away from the caricatures that are the mass media's understanding of who black folks are. You know, this is the 1920s, so at this time, minstrel shows are still a big thing in the United States and in Canada, where white performers are in blackface and they put on caricatures and stereotypical performances of black people. Eugene O'Neill wants to move away from that. He wants black protagonists in his plays to be portrayed as human beings and not as plantation figures or the coon or the brute or the Jezebel or all these archetypes that are laid out in books like, it's escaping me. There's a great book if you want to learn about the history of film and media portrayals of black folks, written by, and Daniel might notice or might be able to tell me later, but it's called Bucks, Coons, Toms, and Mammies. I used to teach this book, I should know it. Bucks, Coons, Toms, and Mammies by a brother out of Philadelphia. But I'll get it to you later. But anyway, were archetypes of what black folks should be. They should be the coon, the buffoon, the mammy character, all these things. Eugene O'Neill wanted to move away from that in his plays and actually show black people as human beings. The problem is Eugene O'Neill is still a white man. So he doesn't know the intricacies of black culture. It's not like he decided to, you know what, I'm going to spend the next 5 years immersed with black people and really learn black culture. He just kind of wrote what he thought about black culture. And he comes up with a play called The Emperor Jones. And Paul Robeson wasn't the first black man to play the protagonist in this play named Brutus Jones. He was the second, but he became the most well-known. In this play, a black Pullman porter gets into some trouble with the law. He ends up going to jail. He's an upstanding man, but he ends up going to jail. He escapes from jail and makes his way to a Caribbean island that's unnamed, but essentially it's supposed to be Haiti. And he ends up becoming emperor through some chicanery and trickery. When Eugene O'Neill got Robeson to play the part, Robeson's reading it and he's playing the part as he knew a Pullman Porter to be. And Eugene O'Neill is like, wait a minute, cut. You know what? You're playing this role a little bit too intelligently. This is what Eugene O'Neill is saying. I'm paraphrasing. This is what he's saying to Paul Robeson. And he said, I want the character to be more street smart, you know, to be more of a hustler, to be able to. And Robeson looks at him and he says, you know, most Pullman Porters have college degrees, right? My brother Bill was a Pullman Porter, and he has his degree from Lincoln University. Most Pullman Porters are actually highly educated black men. And Eugene O'Neill, oh, I didn't know that. He's like, yeah, there's probably a lot you don't know about black folks. So as Robeson is in these plays, he's not just taking the direction from O'Neill, he's bringing his own experience. And eventually, The Emperor Jones would be turned into a feature film much later, probably around 1933. So he's in the play in 1924, 1925, and it tours around the country and to rave reviews. Robeson gets rave reviews for his performance. And he's not even really singing in this play. He gets rave reviews for his performance. He just takes over the stage whenever he's on the stage, and it travels all around the country. What I'm going to show you is footage not from the play, it's actually from the motion picture, which came out in 1933. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you show Robeson in The Emperor Jones? And I'll talk a little bit about this film after we see this clip.
Yes, that was fine. I bet you they know the man when they see him.
Well, if there's any trouble, you only got yourself to blind. Standing him and calling him general.
I'll tell you, Mr. Smithers. Any trouble, you just leave it general to me.
We don't see your excellency.
Show the gentleman in.
Good idea, make it see. Well, top hole, aye? Top hole. As fine a body of men as ever I slept with people on. Hey, what's yours? Yeah, and well found.
I reckon when you figure how little it's costing you, makes you feel mighty proud. Send in the treasure. It's my treasure. Tell the gentleman the truth now. Does you know how to figure?
Yes, your man.
Now you see I got a figure. Produce the contract. Your bill, Mr. Smithers.
Yeah, well, here you are, Your Excellency. Now then, there was 100 uniforms at $5. That's $1,000. There was 100 rifles at $5. $1,000. One cannon was 500 and the ammunition. Well, it adds up to $4,000, Your Excellency.
What does the treasure report?
It seems to me that there might be a little error.
Oh, well, here, let me have a look at it. Yeah, we all make mistakes now and again.
Yes, it is a mistake. I've seen it all along. It's $5,000. There you is, Captain. Check that off and tell it to the board. Fire again! Empty your gun! Don't you all know I've got a charm? Takes a silver bullet to kill Brutus Jones. My turn now, General. Company, attention. Throw him out of here. I'm boss here now. Walter, get out of here. And wait. Them what I want to stay will hear from me in an hour.
as you wait, I want to confer with you.
Well, I pulled it off. You ain't got a nerve.
Nerve and brain.
I called it stinking luck having that there miss you twice at 10 feet.
Pick up that gun. Break it.
Blimey,
You remember when Quacko got drunk in town last night and I take care of his gun while he sleeps it off? Well, that's what I call brain. This place smells more like a chain gang dumped in a palace. Say, Smithers, how you like the contractor doing this dump over?
Now you're talking.
I give you an audience tomorrow. And bring along them fashion sheets that I get last summer. And then I want some mirrors, plenty of them. And remember, Smithers, red's my color. I always have a special taste for red. Mr. President. King Brutus. Oh, somehow that don't make enough noise. Smithers, cigarette. Light.
Who's gonna need more time? Everyone. Now there's 85% more tide in every power pod. This planet's our only home, but we're not treating it that way.
Oh.
Smithers, you have just had an audience with the Emperor Jones.
All right, Daniel, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you. So there's a lot in that. So imagine this on the stage, and it looks a little bit different on the stage, but this represents Haiti. And what had happened in 1915, the U.S. invaded Haiti because of political turmoil, and there was a number of changes in leadership, and it was believed that the Haitians couldn't run their own government. Eugene O'Neill is kind of playing off of that, and he said, well, what would happen if we had this black American come and become the emperor, and how would that work? And it might end up the same way a lot of the other leaders in Haiti ended up. And at the end of the play, I won't give it away, but something happens to the Emperor Jones. Doesn't stay emperor for long. But a lot in this performance. Some people saw this, and they look and they said, wow, it's a black man showing power and presence on stage. You see how he's bossing the white guy, the European weapons contract. That's what that guy is, weapons contract. He sells things to the state. How he's bossing him around, and you don't see stuff like this on stage. But then other folks are looking at Emperor Jones and saying, well, why are the Haitian people being depicted as this? As superstitious, as corrupt, and in needing of this strong figure to kind of control. So it has both of these elements in it. A lot of Robeson's performances that are done by white directors and writers are going to have this ambiguity, because Robeson wouldn't play the traditional stereotypical roles, but at the same time, the action going around his performance is often stereotypical or subtly stereotypical. So you have this dichotomy. But Robeson in his mind, as he's becoming an artist during the 20s and 30s, is saying, I'm going to use these roles to grow my stature so that I will eventually have the power to create the stories that we actually want to tell. So I'm going to make sure I'm shown in this light, take these roles, support myself and my family, and his family is growing. By 1927, he has a son, Paul Robeson Jr. But more importantly, to show a presence of black culture on stage that no one else will ever see. But in order to do that, he has to work with these white producers, white writers, and so on. But that's not the only people he works with. Because in 1925, he gets the role in his first film role. So again, that footage you saw was from the 1933 film production of Emperor Jones, which he starred in 1925. That same year, he's approached by the black movie producer and director and writer, Oscar Micheaux. During the pandemic, we had a series of classes, sessions, dealt with black film, Africana film. And we talked about Oscar Micheaux. Oscar Micheaux was one of the most important black filmmakers of the 20th century. His film, Body and Soul, which came out in 1921, is the oldest existing full-feature black film that we have. It is actually a rejoinder to 1915's Birth of a Nation. It's an answer to Birth of a Nation, and it talks about what really was happening to black people, and it's a really good film. But Oscar Micheaux was completely independent. He financed his films himself. He filmed them himself. He had his own studio. He had his own actors. He wasn't dependent on white folks for anything. He might get financed from white folks, but they didn't have any control over what he would do with his films. Oftentimes, his films were financed by black people. He would raise money himself. He would produce these films himself. He would write these films himself. Now, were they the same budget as the Hollywood films? No, of course not. He never had those budgets. But he did with the resources that he had, he did what he could, and he produced some great films. And one of them is the film Body and Soul. This is Robeson's first starring film. It comes out in 1925. It's a silent film. And in it, Robeson plays two parts. Now, that's hard for an actor to do in a talking film, but in a silent film, to emote in a way that you're showing that you're playing two different characters, it takes a tremendous amount of acting skill. Remember, he had only been professionally acting for about 2-3 years at this point. So it's just showing you how talented he was. So Body and Soul comes out in 1925. In this film, he plays a crooked pastor. He plays a crooked pastor, and he also plays the pastor's identical twin brother who has a good heart and has good character, and they're both after the same young woman. And in the film, the mother of the young woman wants her to be with the pastor, because of course the pastor has money, the pastor has presence and all this, but he's corrupt. He's actually an ex-criminal. He's a rapist. He's a thief. He steals from his congregation. But like so many churchgoers even today, they look past all that because that's their pastor. And he plays it to a T. And remember, as we talked about last week, his father was a pastor. His father was not a corrupt pastor, not by any means. His father was actually a great person, community builder. But Paul Robeson had been in the church, grown up in the church his entire life. He had probably seen pastors like this at different conferences and at different things and being around his father. So he knew how to play the role. He knew exactly what it was supposed to be like. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you put up the film Body and Soul? So we just watched a snippet of Robeson's performance in this silent film from 1925. That's it. All right, Daniel, we can cut it now. That's enough. So you kind of see it, and you can see how his performance looked. This, and a lot of Oscar Micheaux's films are actually controversial, more so in the black community. White community didn't really pay much attention to these films. They were called race films. They were designed for black audiences. They would play in black theaters across the country. There were, at this time, a lot of black movie theaters, particularly Madam C.J. Walker, was the first black female self-made millionaire, made hair care products. She had her own theater in Indianapolis, and there were a number of these theaters across the country. Black folks would watch these films and they would enjoy them, but the black press had an ambivalent appreciation for Micheaux, because some black folks said, how dare you show the church in this light? This is the only institution that we have that we can control except for our universities and things, and you're showing it in this light, and how dare you? But Micheaux said, hey, I'm going to show black life as it is. The good, the bad, the ugly, and everything, because the film has good parts too. But this is what Micheaux did, and it got a lot of criticism. But one thing that wasn't criticized was Robeson's performance. Anyone that watched this film, they said, we might not agree with what Micheaux did, but that young Robeson, oh, wow, he's an amazing actor, and he was able to do this. And this is 1925, the first talking film, major talking film, is The Jazz Singer, which doesn't come out till 2 years later, 1927. And it's really interesting when we look at the history of American film, because a lot of the big breakthroughs in American film always seem to have some type of demeaning representation of black folks. The first huge blockbuster film, the one that kind of set the stage for American cinema, was The Birth of a Nation in 1915. And so many of the features of modern film come out of that, the angles that things are shot at. Students study The Birth of a Nation, not for its content, but for its direction and its production. But 1927, The Jazz Singer, the first talking film to get released, is about a minstrel performer, and he's in blackface. It's Al Jolson, and he's in blackface, and he's doing all these things. So it's really interesting when we look at early American film and how black folks are represented. So Micheaux, Oscar Micheaux and Paul Robeson, they're going against these ideas. They're saying, as black folks, we can tell our own stories. We can tell the good, the bad. We can show black humanity as it is. So Robeson stars in this film. Doesn't get a lot of attention, again, in the white press, but black folks know it, and he's celebrated more. So same year, 1925, Robeson also releases a record that goes on to become incredibly successful. It really came out in an interesting way. He was invited by a group of women to sing Negro spirituals to help raise money for this nursery, and he does so. And people hear him and they say, you should record. You know, you're a great singer, you should record. So he actually records an album in 1925 with 2 songs, Steal Away and this is the major, this is a B-side of it, but I can't remember the other song. But the album becomes a success, the record becomes a success. So now he's making his mark on the stage as an actor, on film, and now, more importantly, he's starting to grow as a concert singer and getting invited to sing all over the country. Popular songs at the time, folk songs, and then especially Negro spirituals. And again, in the black community, there's some ambivalence to this, because there's an upper class of black folks that don't see the Negro spirituals as art. They see it as slave music, reminds them of slavery. They don't want to hear it. They don't think singing it to white people, it will just invite ridicule, and it's patronizing to sing these in front of white folks. And Robeson is saying, no, this is our heritage. This is the songs that I heard growing up. My father was a formerly enslaved person that escaped on the Underground Railroad. And songs like Steal Away to Jesus were used by Steal Away to Jesus, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Wade in the Water. These were songs that had coded messages in them. They weren't just the black folks pining for heaven and for Jesus. They're pining to get to freedom. And Steal Away to Jesus is a code song to get free from the Underground Railroad. I'm going to steal away out of slavery into the North to freedom. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing Robeson's rendition of Steal Away, so we can just listen to how his voice sounded in 1925 and what made this record so popular. Not this. That's for later on.
But long to stay.
All right, thank you, Danny. These are the types of songs that Robeson would sing around the country, packed concert halls. He was singing private performances at people's homes, and people's get-togethers and things like that. But he would, as he grew in stature from a play actor, but these plays would travel around the country, the Eugene O'Neill plays and others, to singing, he became more and more famous. And he had more and more opportunities to play stereotypical roles, which he always refused. So around 1927, he and his wife decide that they get an opportunity to perform concert venues and well as stage acting in London. So at this point, his wife, Islanda, is basically his manager. She had a career actually working in a hospital. She was what was her position? But she was well educated herself. She worked in the medical field. But she stops all that and becomes his manager and helps guide his career. Helps sets up his bookings, keeps him on track, helps him go over lines. She's really supportive in her role as his business manager. So they decide that they're going to move their operation to London. And they're going to be going back and forth over the next decade between London and the US and throughout Europe, performing in concerts, also engaging in stage acting. So we'll stop there and we'll open it up to questions because he's about to take on, it's probably his most well-known role as Othello in London, and we'll talk about the significance of that, but we'll do that after our first break. So any questions or comments from anyone so far? Daniel, anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat, but David, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Dr. Ledbetter, there was a comment or made about students still studying the cinematography of Birth of a Nation. And I was curious, because you mentioned that it was for its, what it portrayed in the aspects of cinematography and not the actual content. But my understanding is cinematography, or whatever is considered the best, is an individual taste and depends on pretty much what you're looking for. Are there not any other examples of that type of cinematography in the 100 and something odd years of movie making that could better represent that perspective?
Yeah, it's because it was the first to do a lot of things. For instance, there's a scene in Birth of a Nation where the Klan rides in on a bunch of horses to like save people, and how it is shot, it was the first time someone had done that type of scene on film from that. It's technical, and I'm not a film person, but those types of things, how D.W. Griffith actually shot certain things. It's the first time on film that you've seen a cavalry charge like that. It's the first time on film that you have these types of things. So it's still shown because he's given credit for being the first person to actually do that. Now, of course, in films, they also show the films of Kurosawa because he did those things in Japanese films and all that. But yeah, they actually still show that film to show this is the history of film, and this is the first person to have this type of shot or this particular close-up when this action is going on, that type of thing. So that's what's going on with that. Do they still do that in 2023? I don't know if they still give him credit for these things, because as much as the content is destructive and painful, he was the first person to do these things. So yeah, they still show it in a lot of institutions.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What I say to that. Thank you.
And again, like I said, it's even going back to the first films. One of the first experiments when Edison is experimenting with what we would now call the film camera. There's this silent film of this black man laughing that is one of the first successful films. And it's completely, it's just some black man with no teeth just laughing. And Edison, I think it's Edison, used this as an example of this is what we can do with this new technology. We can show things like this. So many steps of the way when it comes to the film industry, it's having another medium of mass media to show white superiority and black inferiority. Moving from the minstrel stage to now the same venues often that showed the minstrel shows were some of the same places that you could see early films. They would get the screens and they put the films up. So you'd have it on both forms of media. So it's really interesting. I'll go to you, but let me go to Mr. Francis first, and then I'll go to Robin in the studio.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's undoubtedly obvious that Paul was a multi-talented individual. And I'm wondering, how was his performance in film affected others that followed? Say, for example, Sidney Poitier, Colvin Lockhart, and Sammy Davis, Harry Belafonte, and others like that. Can you talk about that?
He is given a tremendous amount of credit by the people that come after him for his performances. He opened up the doors for a lot of these people that didn't go open up the doors for a lot of other folks. The issue becomes, and we'll start to see this next week and then the week after, when those people start to emerge, Robeson is already blacklisted. So it almost becomes a taboo to mention Robeson because of things that we'll talk about next week and what happens. So it's not until when he dies in '76 it becomes very safe to talk about Robeson. But particularly in the 1950s and in the 1960s, he's almost persona non grata because of the political stance that he takes that we'll get into next week. But later on, all these actors and folks, they all say, you know, Robeson opened up the door for us to be able to do what we were doing, particularly people like Poitier, because of the stances that he would take and the roles that he would play and not play. Robeson was a key influence in those types of decisions. So, yeah, that's a really good point. Robin, go ahead.
Just a comment about what you were saying about how the film has been used to like show black folks as kind of like powerless and everything. So just saying that a number of groups are suing the Ottawa Police Services Board. Two of them are black groups, okay? The CBC didn't cover the story. So I wrote to the editor to say, just curious, what, you didn't think this was a story? And her response was, this is Felice Chin. She said, yeah. Her story was, she said, oh, we don't normally cover small claims things. And I'm like, all right, I can totally understand that because most small claims things are like people suing their roof and everything. This is a group of organizations, two of them black-led, suing the Ottawa Police Services Board for violating our charter rights. Isn't that kind of different? Her answer is, quote, hi, Robin. I appreciate your passion. However, anyone can sue anyone for any entity for anything and for any unprecedented reason. It may become a story when we know what the outcome is. Thank you.
There you go. There you go. Media. I think I saw something posted in the chat, Daniel. Was there a question that came up in the chat?
Yes, somebody said, can you go over his relationship in regards to the political climate with other prominent people of the African diaspora like Amy Garvey?
You're anticipating me. That's what we're going to talk about now. You're anticipating me. So hold on about 5 minutes. We're right about to get into that. Specifically, Amy Garvey. Yes, we will.
There's another question somebody just posted. Somebody asked, did he and his wife have the foresight to put away savings in anticipation that he might be blacklisted, or did he and his wife survive off contributions from folks who supported him quietly?
We'll get into the blacklisting and what happened with all that next week. I will say that they were pretty prudent with money. I mean, they spent because they became celebrities. Paul becomes a celebrity, so you know they lived a celebrity life. Once we get to this point in London, he starts making more money. They start living in nicer places. They travel around the world. Paul himself was never overly concerned with money. He was more interested in being an artist. And this is the time period where he starts to form in his mind what it means to be an artist. So he wasn't overly concerned with money, but as Londa knew about money, she came from a family with money. Remember, Paul comes from a family that, I mean, they did all right. They weren't wealthy by any means. His father was a pastor, but you know, they weren't doing, you know, extremely well. But her family comes from money, so she kind of knew how to manage things. Paul was more about I want to perform, I want to spread this art, I want to do these things. He wasn't really concerned about money. But we'll talk about what happens with him financially and things next week with the blacklisting, because we still got some time to get to that point. So, Paul and his family moved to London. He begins performing in plays as well as singing concerts. A lot of his concerts are attended by the high society of London and Europe. You know, he performs before royalty in different groups and things. But then in 1931, 31 or 33, he's given the role of a lifetime for any stage actor, and that's to perform Shakespeare in London. And he's given the role of Othello. Now, if you know the play Othello, Othello is about a high-achieving Moor, a Moor. These are North Africans that had taken over Spain and Portugal for some time. And the play is about this Moor, Othello, who's a general, and he is well-known and well-liked, and he has a white wife named Desdemona. There's racial undertones, and it's a tragedy. And the climactic element of this play is Othello strangling this white woman to death, and then Othello kills himself. But no black man had played Othello in England since the mid-1800s, and there was a brother named Ira Aldrich who should be studied himself. He was a black man born in New York in the 1820s, leaves the United States because of racism. He's an actor, he goes to London, and he gets rave reviews for playing Othello on the English stage, becomes a celebrity in England, Ira Aldrich. But since then, no black man has played Othello in London, and Robeson is given that task, and he studies. He studies Shakespeare, he studies hard, and he comes out and he plays, and it's a phenomenal performance, and gets a lot of rave reviews. He also, and I won't get into this too much because you can read about it in these books, at this time, he also starts an extramarital affair with Peggy Ashcroft, the white woman that plays Desdemona in the play. He also has some other extramarital affairs. His wife has some extramarital affairs. There's a point where they're about to divorce, and Robeson is intending to marry some other white English woman. But then he starts thinking about it. He said, that's not going to look good to my black fans if I marry this black woman that stood by me, that put me on, that worked when I was a struggling actor. I'm going to leave. That's not going to look good. And he ends up reconciling with his wife, and they reconcile and they continue to have their marriage. But there's a lot that goes into that. I don't want to get into his personal life too much because it doesn't really. You can read about it in his politics, but it just goes to show that this stuff is new with actors messing with their co-stars and all that type of stuff. And there's the climactic scene. This play could not have been put on in the United States at this time. It barely was put on in London. Because again, you got this big 6'4", 240-pound black man choking a white woman out on stage. Like, that's not in the 1920s, and early 30s. So that's not something that you're going to see. But it got, again, rave reviews for Othello. He's singing all over London. But that doesn't stop him, of course, from facing the good old-fashioned racism that even exists in England. Because in 1929, it made international news that he was barred from one of the hotels in London. Now, he was used to this type of treatment in the U.S. There are plenty of places that he had been barred from, hotels and places he couldn't go to. But London was supposed to be, at least for African Americans, they saw Europe as being a little bit more liberal. Well, he found out the hard way. It's like, no, it's not. Because this London barred him and any other black folks, particularly West Indians, who tried to go into it. So this is from the Chicago World, a black newspaper in America. It said, before sailing for New York Saturday, Robeson, actor and singer, wrote to friends that he and Miss Robeson had been barred from the dining room of a local hotel on account of his color. Robeson said that he did not want to even visit the hotel, but had been invited and importuned by white friends who protested. But waiters and finally the manager refused to change the anti-Negro policy. West Indians who may be English citizens are also barred from England's color line. One white man visited 20 hotels, vainly seeking accommodation for a colored friend. Robert Abbott of Chicago was turned down this season by 30 white hotels there. So again, he's not escaping this. But more importantly about his time in London, he's also engaging with, someone just mentioned Amy Garvey. He's engaging with the black folks in London, because London is a metropole. Just like Harlem was a metropole where you had Africans coming from all over the world to Harlem during the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, Paris and London are the same thing. This is 1930s. This is the height of colonialism. All of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, is a colony of some European power or another, with the exception of Ethiopia. Liberia, they say, is independent. Liberia is a settler colony of the United States. So everywhere in Africa is either controlled by France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, or I think I mentioned all of them. So this is what's going on. So in England, you have Nigerians, you have Kenyans, you have blacks from the West Indies, you have Ugandans, all in the metropole, either as students or as workers. So Paul's engaging with all of them. He's engaging with people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore, the Trinidadian Pan-Africanists that are there. Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, is also there. She's organized. In 1925, she, alongside Nigerian student Oladipo Solanke, organized the West African Student Union. And these students are there in London thinking about how do we get independence. First, they're fighting for self-government. Many of them are from the upper class in Africa, so there's still this ambivalence about, do we want complete independence or do we want to just have self-government, kind of like Canada in relation to England. So they're debating these ideas in the 20s, in the 30s, and Robeson is there. He's talking with these students, he's engaging with them, and he actually writes this. It's in London. He says, I discovered Africa in London. That discovery, back in the 20s, profoundly influenced my life. Like most of Africa's children in America, I had known little about the land of our fathers. But in England, where my career as an actor and singer took me, I came to know many Africans. Some of their names are now known to the world: Azikiwe and Nkrumah and Kenyatta, who has just been jailed for his leadership of the liberation struggles in Kenya. Many of these Africans were students, and I spent many hours talking with them and taking part in their activities in the West African Student Union building. Somehow, they came to think of me as one of them. They took pride in my successes, and they made Mrs. Robeson and me honorary members of the union. Besides these students, who were mostly of princely origin, I also came to know another class of Africans, the seamen in the ports of London, Liverpool, and Cardiff. They too had their organizations, and much to teach me of their lives and their various peoples. So it's in London that Paul Robeson discovers Africa. He's engaging with it. And when I say discovers, he also studies Africa. He never gave up that academic drive that he had. Everything that he went into, he studied. He studied his roles, what his motivations would be. Every song that he sang, he studied it. He gets to the point in the 1920s and 30s, he can sing Russian folk songs, Irish folk songs, Scottish folk songs, German folk songs, and then he starts to learn African languages. He learns Swahili. He learns Twi, the language spoken in Ghana. He's learning these African languages and learning African songs so that he can sing them and put them. He would go to concerts. He would sing a Negro spiritual, then an African song, and then a song from Russia. And he learned the languages. He had an ear for languages. So he's a multilingualist, and him and his wife would go to the universities in London and actually study African culture and learn it, and then learn from these students. He was immersing himself in Africa and then learning more about the politics of colonialism and the anti-colonial struggle. He's also engaging with the working class people in London and learning about their struggles. And at the same time, he's going back and forth to the United States, touring and making money and doing these things. So he never loses that connection with the people in the Harlem Renaissance, like Du Bois and Claude McKay and the others. So he's a part of this international movement of the African world that's happening in the 30s. And of course, the Garveys play a huge role in this. Marcus Garvey, we already talked about his organization. We're actually going to talk about what Garvey thought about Robeson in 1935, which was not flattering. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he befriends the first Mrs. Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was an activist in her own right. And again, she's one of the founders of the West African Student Union. So he's learning about Africa. He's learning from black folks, African folks from the Caribbean. They're all exchanging ideas. And it's informing him as an artist. So he decides that I'm going to use my artistry to promote African American culture as an aspect of African culture. So he starts to do this. That same time, around that same time, again, seeing Paul Robeson directed and produced by black directors and producers is a different Paul Robeson than what you'll see when he's produced by white. I won't say completely different, but the performances are more authentic. He has a performance as Toussaint L'Ouverture in a play written by C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is a great Trinidadian activist and writer and historian and journalist. He started out he covered cricket, and he was schoolhood friends with George Padmore, another Trinidadian Pan-Africanist, and he wrote 2 important books. C.L.R. James wrote the quintessential book on the Haitian Revolution called The Black Jacobins. He went to the archives in Paris and he pulled up a lot of materials and he compiled them into this classic text on the Haitian Revolution. He also wrote History of Pan-African Revolt, which covered rebellions throughout the Caribbean and the African world. These are 2 great books by C.L.R. James. And he writes this play about Toussaint L'Ouverture and that goes on in London. But because of the nature of the play, the revolutionary value of the play, and C.L.R. James was a revolutionary, and make no mistakes about it. He was a socialist, he believed in independence, and this was his thinking. So when Robeson plays Toussaint L'Ouverture, it's an amazing performance, sold out house, but there's only 2 performances of it because no one would finance this play. No one in London would say, we want this revolutionary play about this African leader to be financed, to be shown to folks. So it was only 2 performances, but from the records we have of the reviews, they say they were magnificent. And of course, Robeson threw himself into the role of Toussaint, studying the Haitian Revolution, studying everything he could. And remember, think back to last week, when he was graduating high school, and he was in that oratorical contest. The thing that he read back when he was a teenager was a speech by Wendell Phillips about Toussaint L'Ouverture. So he's had this connection and pride in the Haitian Revolution. In fact, one of his goals was to get famous enough and powerful enough in media that he was going to be able to finance and film his own feature film about the Haitian Revolution. It's really funny. This is almost 100 years ago, or 90 years ago when he's having these ideas. And Danny Glover, over the past 20 years, actually probably longer than that, has been having the same goal of producing a feature film, full-length feature film about the Haitian Revolution. I think Glover got close. He was getting some financing from Venezuela, I think, at one point, but it's never come to pass. There's something about this story that no major, actually, to be honest, and I kind of share the position that Gerald Ball, the black journalist, and he has a YouTube channel called I Mix What I Like, and he's a professor of communications and Africana studies. He always talks about we shouldn't even have major motion pictures studios tell these stories because they're always going to probably insert some white savior figure or do something that waters it down. But just the fact that they won't even touch the Haitian Revolution, which we're going to talk about actually in December and January in this course. But he throws himself into the role, and there's a book that talks about this entire relationship and this entire time period where Robeson is in this play that only runs twice. C.L.R. James said of Robeson, I do not believe that any human being in the 20th century, which is what I know, achieved the worldwide fame and recognition that Paul Robeson did. It was not only his singing, his public performance, his tremendous personality. At the time he came forward in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, moving to the war and after the war, a great change was taking place in the world at large. People were beginning to at last recognize that black people were like anyone else. Previous to that, they had looked upon us as some sort of subordinate type. But if in the 30s, particularly after the crisis in 1929 and the recognition that a new state had come into the world, Soviet Russia, people began to have a different attitude. And the attitude was not only in politics and in word, the attitude was not only in people who were acting and singing, the attitude was expressed very sharply and concretely in the personality of Paul Robeson. This is C.L.R. James reflecting back in 1985. And it's really interesting that he mentioned the Soviet Union. Because in 1934, Paul Robeson's going to take a trip to the Soviet Union that's going to change his outlook on a lot of things, or confirm things that he had already believed. Because of his fame exploding in London, exploding in the Americas, the Russians reach out to him. They said, we would like you to come to the Soviet Union. And he does. And at the time, this is right before the Cold War begins, but there's still this growing animosity between the Western capitalist world, led by England, France, the United States, and this emerging Soviet Union. The Soviet Revolution had occurred, or the Russian Revolution occurs 1917, 1918. The Soviets take over and it becomes the Soviet Union. And the ideology of the Soviet Union is scientific socialism, leading to communism. It's antithetical to capitalism, the economic and political philosophy of the West. The other things the Soviets pride themselves on is that they are anti-imperialists. The architect of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, writes a book called Imperialism, The Last Stage of Capitalism, where he says the peoples of the world that are currently under imperial domination are going to rise up, and this is going to how we're going to change the world to a socialist world. So it became Soviet policy to support any people that were colonized under imperialism. And including in that definition was not just Asian folks that were under colonization of Europeans or African countries that were under European colonization. The Soviets said that in the United States, black people living in the South and throughout the United States are part of a subordinate nation. The Soviet policy was to view black people not as just a racial minority, but as a nation within a nation. It was called the Black Belt thesis, that we should be treating black people in the United States and giving them the same support that we're giving black folks in Africa and folks in Asia that are fighting against colonialism. At the time in the Soviet Union in 1934, 1936, Stalin is in charge. Stalin creates a new constitution in the Soviet Union in 1936, which explicitly outlaws racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination in the Soviet Union. No country in the world has this in their constitution. So Robeson gets there in 1934, and he says, this is the first time I've been treated like a human being. It's not like when I went to London, and I'm barred from certain hotels, and I'm treated like this. When I go to the Soviet Union, I'm treated like a human being. My son is treated like a human being, because he brings his son along with him and his wife. They're treated like human beings in the Soviet Union. Something about this socialism has created an atmosphere where there is no racial hostility, and people are judged based on what they can contribute. And he says people are treated humanely. Now, granted, he is an official visitor. So he's basically showing what the Soviet Union wants him to see, but even when he's not really performing in concerts, he actually performs for workers, impromptu performances. He goes and he meets with the everyday working people when he can, and he would perform these songs in Russian, in perfect Russian, because he had studied Russian. And the people would say, wow, it's amazing that you're able to do this. And his son was treated well. So he comes back out of the Soviet Union and he says, this model, the Soviets are showing the rest of the world what anti-racism really looks like. Now, granted, a lot was going on in the Soviet Union that he wasn't privy to. Stalin is killing a lot of people at this time. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of power struggles and things. But for the most part, he can look at the policy of the Soviet Union. It's right there in the Constitution. We do not allow racial discrimination of any kind in the Soviet Union. No one else in the world had that in their Constitution up to this point. So Robeson is starting to look at the Soviet Union as a possible model for economic organization, but more importantly, anti-racism. Now, this isn't going to become a big deal right now, not in 1934, 1936. But after World War II, this is going to become a very big deal. But right at this point, it's kind of the British authorities, the Western authorities in the U.S. are kind of looking like, all right, we don't really agree with this. We'll see where it goes. But it becomes a very big problem. We'll talk about it next week after World War II. So he's in the Soviet Union. He comes back. And again, through his engagement with the African students in London, his trip to the Soviet Union, he's now thinking, all right, I need to be more selective with the roles that I take. I want to make sure, I want to do some roles where I play an African, but I want to show African in a non-stereotypical light. The same way I don't want to play stereotypical depictions of African Americans, I don't want to play stereotypical depictions of Africans. So he actually signs up for this film called Sanders of the River. And he thinks, okay, this will be an opportunity to show an African kid, and he's going to play an African chief in this film. He signs up, he plays the film. In fact, one of his friends, Jomo Kenyatta, who's going to lead Kenya toward independence, has a bit part in this film as well. And they're thinking, okay, finally, we're going to show Africa on film and have an African story that's not stereotypical. Well, it was wrong. His acting wasn't necessarily stereotypical, but of the way that they shot the film, the way that they edited the film, not only did it have stereotypical elements of Africa, but more importantly, the film became almost an apology for European colonization. When I say apology, I mean in that it showed European colonization as a good thing. Because essentially applied to this film, the British administrator of this fictional part of Nigeria, I think it's supposed to be set in Nigeria, is perceived dead. And when he dies, or the word goes around that this colonial administrator is dead, basically all hell breaks loose in this territory. And these African chiefs start fighting each other and all this. This was almost a message of, see, if we leave, if we give you independence, this is what's going to happen. But when Robeson's acting and he's filming the role, he doesn't see how they're going to do the final cut. Not until the film premieres in 1935. He's sitting in the premiere and he sees how they put the film together, and he actually walks out of the film in disgust because of what he sees on the film. And he's starting to realize that these big productions, Hollywood or the English film industry, are never going to show Africans and black people as a whole the way that they desire to be shown. It's just not going to happen. So he's starting to think, okay, what can I do? Let me get as famous as I possibly can. And this is the mentality of a lot of our actors and people in Hollywood even to this day. If I get to a point that I'll be able to control things, then maybe I can tell these stories. And this seems to be the same mentality that we have today. There's a lot of actors that say, well, I take these roles, I do these things, so that way I can get big enough, then I can get into the position where then I can make the movies, or I can do this and I can do that. But somehow it just doesn't seem to, maybe we've turned the corner recently in the past 10 years. I'm not sure we could debate about that, but we'll talk about it. But that's what happened with this film, Sanders of the River. When this comes out, Marcus Garvey is still alive. He doesn't pass away until 1940, and he's in London too at this time. And Garvey rips Paul Robeson in his journal called The Black Man. And in 1935, Garvey says this. He said, Paul Robeson, the Negro actor, has left London for Hollywood. He's gone there to make another slanderous picture against the Negro. He is to be one of the stars in the new picture, Stevedore. This is a propaganda play engineered for the purpose of emphasizing Negro inferiority and white superiority. We admire Paul Robeson as an artist, but as a representative of the race, he is a poor specimen in that he always allows himself to be featured in those plays that do more harm than good to his race. For quite a while, some Negroes used to look upon any Negro adopted by white people and placed in any remunerative position as a great man of the race. Today, that kind of sentiment is changed. The people are becoming more critical, and he is not regarded in the same light by thoughtful Negroes. It is hoped that he is making enough money for himself so that when he retires from the stage, he may be able to square his conscience with his race by doing something good for it. Yeah, Garvey didn't hold his tongue. And internally, this is what Robeson is feeling. He feels bad that he was duped into this movie that he thought was going to portray Africans in a certain way, and it didn't. And again, he wasn't the only one. Jomo Kenyatta, who again leads Kenya and is, a couple of years later going to be arrested by the English for, leading the Land and Freedom Army, was in this movie too. So they all were duped. But Garvey and a lot of the black press were like, you can't do films like this. And Robeson is slowly realizing that, no, I'll never be able to present the way I want to present. He finds that out again in another film that he's in called The Song of Freedom. He thought, okay, this one might give me the opportunity to show Africa in a good light. This film, it's a little bit better than Sanders of the River, but it's still problematic. This film is about a black dock worker in London who has this great singing voice, and he's discovered by this opera producer, and he's becomes really famous. But then he finds out he's a descendant of this African ruler in Africa, and he has this pendant that's been in his family since slavery that shows this. And he goes back to Africa, and he proves himself to the people by singing the song in their language, because it's a song that his family has passed down to him, and he sings a song, and he becomes the chief, and he then spends his time going back and forth between London and Africa, singing in London, making this money, and bringing technological advancement back to his people in Africa. So for Robeson, he said, okay, this sounds like a great role. You know, I can show Africa in a positive light. You know, we can show that this black man is using his talent to help support Africa, these types of things. It didn't turn out like that. The film has so many problems. Matter of fact, let me just show you the beginning of this film. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind putting up the beginning of this film, and you'll be able to see right away, you know, the issues with this film called Song of Freedom.
Said he wanted to come with you. Oh. He ran away from Zinga on the island. He's our son. There had been a killing going on. Killing? Eh? All ready. Well, I only got here. They want to take a trip along with us. Well, is he all right? All right. Royal President, Red. Go on, get along before they change their mind. All right, Daddy.
All right, Daniel, thank you. So, I mean, you can see from the beginning that this film has a lot of problems. One, they've taken names of actual African rulers. Like they have his name as John Zinga, that's his last name, and they say his family run away from the evil Queen Zinga. Now, if you're taking our history class, you know about Queen Njinga, and she fought against the slave trade and how she was portrayed by the Europeans and all that. So the writer of this film took that name, took the kingdom that she was momentarily in charge of, Kasanga, and makes this fictionalized account of this evil drunken queen that's killing people and doing all this. And then you got these two African people that willfully give themselves to the slave trade, as opposed to staying in savage Africa. So you see, but Robeson thought when he did this film that, okay, it's going to show Africa the light. He read his lines, was recorded, doesn't see what this is edited into. But even still, with all that, with all these problems, in 1936, this was actually seen as progressive representation of Africa. For 1936. So much so that when Song of Freedom was actually released, or later on, Kwame Nkrumah actually showed this film at one of the meetings of his Convention People's Party. And actually, when Ghana becomes independent, he actually invited Robeson to be the head of drama at one of the universities in Ghana, but his health wouldn't allow him to take it. But it's really interesting how folks perceive this film, because they were looking more at the overall message of a black man being so committed to helping build Africa that he's willing to use his career to build his country. But there's so many other aspects of this movie that it shouldn't be. But after this, Robeson's thinking about his career. He's thinking about where he's at, the level of fame that he's achieved, and his level as an artist. And up until this point, he hasn't really said much in terms of politics. You know, he's talked about the equality of African and African American culture with other world cultures. He's talked about what it means to be, at the time, a Negro artist, and how he's using it to promote equality among the human races. But his time in London in the 1930s and his travels have given him a new political consciousness, where he wants to establish himself as clearly and openly anti-colonial, and also openly an advocate of socialism. And this idea that working class people of the world are incredibly threatened by capitalism and encroaching fascism. Because he also has seen the uprising of Nazism in Germany and the beginnings of Hitler's regime in the 1930s. On his way to the Soviet Union, he travels through Nazi Germany in 1934. He's beginning to see the Spanish Civil War. He's engaging with the anti-colonial struggles of not just African folks, but also Asian people as well that are struggling in French Indochina, which becomes Vietnam. He's seeing all this unfold right before World War II. And then more importantly, in 1935, like so many Africans around the world, he's influenced when Italy invades Ethiopia. And when Italy invades Ethiopia, black African activists all over the world decide that we need to support Ethiopia. Garvey is really interesting because all these people are in London at the same time. Garvey, Robeson, Nkrumah is not there yet, but a lot of West African students are. Ezekwe might be in London at this time. Amy Ashwood Garvey is there. And then in 1935, Haile Selassie is there. Now at first, all Africans around the world are like, we gotta support Ethiopia, we gotta support Haile Selassie, the emperor who has left Ethiopia to kind of go to get support in England as Italy is bombing and using chemical warfare against Ethiopians. And Garvey and some other representatives of the African world are actually at the train station to meet Haile Selassie, and he kind of rebuffs them. And Garvey at this point is just completely denounces Haile Selassie. He says he's just a tyrant. He lives off the back of the off of feudalism in Ethiopia, and he exploits poor people in Ethiopia. And not only that, he's a coward. When the Italians came and they bombed Ethiopia, instead of staying and fight, you ran to England. So Garvey is not kind to Haile Selassie. But many Africans, students and other folks, Selassie aside, they want to support Ethiopia. A number of African Americans actually want to go fight in Ethiopia. One does, Colonel Johnny C. Robeson. And Garvey and others form an organization called the International Friends of Abyssinia. And C.L.R. James is the president of this organization. Amy Ashwood Garvey is a key player. Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian communist organizer who had been organized in the U.S. Now she's based in London. She's an advocate. So you have Robeson in these circles. He starts his own organization, actually, called the Council on African Affairs. And by the time we get to 1937-38, he is openly political. And it's a politics that's anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist. And he's going to continue down this path, still trying to be an artist, but now being openly political. And next week, we're going to pick up with what happens when Robeson becomes incredibly political, and when the world changes after World War II, and this Cold War begins to emerge, and how his politics are a threat to Western interests, and how he has to make a decision. Am I going to try to continue to be a successful artist, and success meaning material success and international fame, or am I going to stick to my principles? We'll talk about that.